Welcome to the Eureka Centre, and thanks for joining us for Talking History. My name is Anthony Cam. I'm the manager here at the Eureka Centre. I'd like to begin very appropriately tonight, given what we'll be discussing, by acknowledging that we meet on the land of the Wadawurrung people, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And tonight we are pleased to welcome Madelyn Shaw and Dr. Trish FitzSimons to the Eureka Centre to present a talk based on their new book, Fleeced, Unravelling the History of Wool and War. Fleeced exposes how heightened demand for wool in wartime existed historically in an international vortex of negotiation, intrigue and anxiety, and the unexpected effects of this on how we dress today. The 19th century rise of industrial manufacture of woolen fabrics and Southern Hemisphere sheep husbandry supported an enormous increase in the size of 20th century armies. But wool was also central to the frontier wars. Victoria's Port Phillip Bay and Western districts were key nodes in how sheep took over much of Australia, but some of the fiercest resistance to the invading settlers came from the Gunditjmara. Victoria was also pivotal in the world's wool market coming to be centred in Australia. And I think we all know about Australia's glorious wool history and how it was Australia and I think Argentina were the two richest countries in the world at one point in time. But tonight we're going to explore this global history in a very nuanced way, and also looking at maybe some of the dark aspects of that story. So we have two very special guests with us today. Madelyn Shaw, who's with us all the way from the United States of America. So welcome. You've come a long way to be with us and we appreciate it. Madelyn is a curator and author, specialising in the exploration of American culture and history through textiles and dress. She has published widely, curated more than 50 exhibitions, and has held positions at the National Museum of American History, the Smithsonian Institute, and the Textile Museum in Washington, D.C., amongst many other institutional roles. Dr. Trish FitzSimons is adjunct professor at the Griffith Film School at Griffith University in Brisbane. She's also a documentary filmmaker, historian, and an exhibition curator. And so thanks for joining us today. It's going to be a fascinating conversation. I'd just like to remind everyone, if you could please turn off your devices, that would be great. There will be some time for questions at the end. We'll devote about 10 minutes to questions. There is a book available, this book that they'll be talking about tonight, which is Fleeced. We've got copies at the front desk, so if you'd like to purchase one, Tanya will be there after the talk and you can purchase one from her. There will also be a table and Trish and Madelyn will be there if you'd like your books signed. So please join me in welcoming our special guests. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anthony, for that lovely introduction. It's such a pleasure to be right here, right now, looking out at you. And yes, thank you so much for coming. I'm Trish, and this is Madelyn. I want to start by thanking the staff here at the Eureka Centre for bringing tonight together. We, Hermione Higgins, who can't be here tonight but did a great job, and Anthony Cam, it's been such a pleasure to meet him tonight. This is part of 7 different venues we're going to, and let's just say there's been none easier than this one. So thank you to the staff. I also would like to acknowledge the Wadawurrung people of the land that we meet on, and specifically we would like to acknowledge that sheep and the associated wool industry were critical to the sort of the dynamic of the invasion of this continent, but also that Aboriginal people have contributed hugely to the wool industry. Tup Bateman and the 8 generations of her family are threaded through our book, Fleeced. Tups was a wool classer and her mum's still alive, aged 99. She's a shearer's cook. So Aboriginal people are threaded through through many chapters of this book. Now, I'm about to talk about a general audience, but I want to know about you. Hands up if you've got wool in your family or personal history. There you go. So you're not a general audience. You're a kind of a wool adjacent audience. But if I ask to a general audience to name strategic commodities, wool may not leap to many people's minds. But Fleeced argues that wool is indeed one strategic commodity, an important one, and that arguably the 20th century of mass warfare could not have occurred without the industrialisation of wool textile production. Not everything about wool is warm and fuzzy. We argue that the intersection of wool and war provides a backstory too to the contemporary problem of fast fashion and microplastic pollution, the currently ubiquitous polyester fleece fabric having from the 1980s knocked wool off its perch in the panoply of global textiles. So, where did this project come from? Serendipity brought us together. I was in New York in July 2014 on research leave for a quite different project. I'd spent the plane trip from Hawaii to New York reading my grandfather's letters, my grandfather Frederick Harper Booth, who was a wool buyer, and he'd written to my great-grandparents who were in Melbourne as he learned the wool trade between 1904 and 1907. I'd had the transcripts even of his letters for 30 years, but had never read them until that day. And those letters and some associated documents pointed strongly to there being a complex politics around wool amidst wartime. So, holding those thoughts, I happened into Madelyn's sesquicentenary exhibition, then at the New York Historical Society, and it included lots about the politics of textiles in that conflict. I had to meet her. We were going to Boston anyway, and the people from the Wool Textile Museum, the Textile History Museum of America, passed on her connections. I visited her in Rhode Island. We had a long lunch, completely sober, but long, and at the end of it, we dreamed up the gist of this project. That gist was that wool had been a strategic priority in many wars, and that by the 1860s, Australasian wool was becoming critical to overall wool supply in and out of wartime. We soon realised that World War I was pivotal in goading the wool have-not nations, the wool textile manufacturing nations, to react to UK control of its empire's wool by actively exploring alternatives. It took a bit longer to realise that the book we were writing was not only about the intersection of wool and war, but also that we were telling a big part of the why behind the current overwhelming share of synthetic textiles. And remarkably, nobody had written that history.
Over the 11 years of this project, there has barely been a trip that either of us has taken that has not found itself a fleeced, a wool, a synthetic fiber dimension. So we have been at places as disparate as the Golden Fleece pub in York, in England, has a great sign. The Cloth Hall in Ypres. We've been to Cape Grim, Tasmania, which was the scene of one of the worst massacres of Indigenous people by settlers who were trying to bring sheep onto the land. And also to the big island of Hawaii, which oddly enough was a big part of the 19th century global supply of wool, and the sheep and the cattle introduced onto Hawaii just really decimated the local landscape. We have been to many shuttered and too few operating woolen mills of various kinds. On the left, I'm bad at left, right. Okay, here is the Saltaire Mills complex in Yorkshire, and this is the Nundle Woolen Mill in New South Wales. We have finally, we have spent a lot of time in museums and libraries. We have talked to a lot of people, not just curators, but mill owners, workers, graziers, pastoralists, curators, historians, serving and former military. But what really helped drive this project was the way we had access to objects in museums and historical societies and archives. And we've been to places like the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney, obviously, the Wool Museum in Geelong, the Swedish Royal Treasury, and the Cutty Sark Clipper Ship in London, and places like the U.S. Quartermaster's Museum in Virginia. All of these places preserve stories, objects, images that have both inspired and enriched our research journey. And they have also informed our sort of loosely chronological chapter organization. And I should warn you that the first few chapters are a gallop through centuries of wool history so that we can set up the World War I period on. We found that if you take a military uniform from any country in any war, from at least the United States Civil War, which began in 1861, through the Korean War of the 1950s, it would contain at least some Australasian wool. And after 1900, it would also contain wool from other British Empire sources like South Africa, or perhaps South America, which, although not politically controlled by Britain, had reliant on British capital. Wool was such a major industrialized textile and strategic resource in the 20th century because of that, but it so depended on these huge extended supply chains. These were so vulnerable in wartime. And this set up a politics of wool sales and wool scarcity that would reverberate down the decades. Pay attention to the Clark Gable uniform over there, which was made in Yorkshire by a local military tailor. One of the things that might surprise you is that fashion and military uses of wool are not entirely separate. In our years of research, we found that they were intrinsically interlinked. Clark Gable's resplendent dress uniform that you saw before shows that fashion is a kind of Janus face to military wear, both inflects and reflects military styles. And in addition, citizens, like the poor woman in the painted-on bathing suit here, have been regularly forced to change their patterns of consumption during wartime. And textile and clothing manufacturers have also explicitly deployed fashion after wars were over to reignite consumer demand. One important example of that is Christian Dior's New Look in the late 1940s, which was rolled out in Australia in association with the department store David Jones. And this is a classic example of that. The other wonderful example is the wool demobilization suit that was given by the British government to every soldier coming out of World War II so they could transition back into civilian life. This allowed Britain's Montague Burton Company to transition from making bulk uniforms and sort of bulk ready-to-wear suits to becoming Burton's, the largest post-war UK menswear retail chain ever. So novelist J.P. Priestley said that these suits turned ex-servicemen into, and we quote, princes amongst paupers, end quote, in a Britain that was still really amid austerity regulations.
Thank you. So how did we approach researching this huge story from opposite sides of the globe? Well,
wine and coffee.
Wine and coffee on Zooms, thousands upon thousands of emails, but also this is the time, I think, Griffith University brought Madelyn on a research fellowship in 2015. She was a senior Fulbright Fellow in 2019. AWI, Australian Wool Innovation, funded us to make a film that included taking me to film in the Smithsonian. The Queensland Government Smithsonian Fellowship took me back to America in 2019, and Madelyn was a National Library Fellow in 2022. So we have crossed paths many times, but there's been a lot of email. But getting to methods more specifically, all of our previously mentioned travels have supported our interest and passion in the capacity of objects to tell stories, and to the value of pulling at threads of family histories. There's 6 generations of the men in my mum's family, at least, that were wool buyers, but there are lots of these families that where wool and connection to wool passes down through the family. Many of the objects we've encountered along the way in museums and private collections are discussed in the text in varying depths of detail and with links in the notes to the host institution and, where available, the online collection record. But we chose several to serve as our chapter header objects. So at centre, these unfinished socks still on the needles with an accompanying letter. Fanny MacDonald of Charters Towers in outback Queensland was knitting these for her son Jim in France in the war, in World War I in 1917, well before she received, in December, his October 17th letter requesting socks for the upcoming winter, and also before she received the November notice from the War Office of his death at Passchendaele on October 21st, so 4 days later. She put the socks and his last letter home away. They lead you into chapter 1, which explores all the varieties and meanings of wool in and out of wartime. Chapter 3 discusses frontier war and the vast expansion of sheep pastoralism in the 19th century. It's headed by the pitchery bag at left, which combines traditional materials and techniques with parts of a woolen blanket. It's a great example, in our opinion, of Aboriginal people adapting to the realities of a colonised continent and bringing new parts of the colonisers' culture into their own. Chapter 7 is headed by a Japanese airman's flying suit, seen at right, worn by the current owner, whose uncle brought it back from New Guinea in 1945 as a war souvenir. Additional chapter header images are sprinkled through the illustrations for this talk. Their captions are in bold. So, the huge armies of World War I were made possible by several 19th century developments, including what we've called the triple helix of frontier warfare, hybridised sheep, and industrialising woolen textile industry. The woolen industry industrialised and mechanised a few decades later than the cotton industry in the second quarter of the 19th century. That development relied on the careful hybridising of sheep to create animals that could cope with tough southern hemisphere environments. The Pepin family at Wanjanella, which is not so many hours away from here, were critical to that. And what that sheep hybridising was about was, as well as tough animals, it was about creating fleeces with staples long enough to be processed by the factory machines. This in turn could not have happened with the land of so many Indigenous peoples, mainly in the Southern Hemisphere, and all the sheep that came with their owners. Local populations losing their land in favour of sheep had happened before this triple helix really came together. The highland clearances were where absentee landlords, over about a century from 1750, effectively removed highland Scottish crofters from their farms and replaced them with sheep. The clearances ramped up during the Napoleonic Wars. A contemporary observer wrote, and I quote, "Shut out from foreign supplies and in a state of hostility or non-intercourse with all Europe and North America, almost all the necessities of life had to be drawn from our own soil. Hence all the speculations to get rid of human inhabitants of the highlands and to replace them with cattle and sheep for the English market. Note to ourselves, supply chain problems and supply chain interruptions can and do change the course of history radically. Many of those displaced by the highland clearances emigrated and ended up in turn displacing Indigenous peoples, including in regions that were becoming enmeshed in the global wool trade. Gippsland, I'm looking at you. And apparently I only discovered a few days back, and I've not yet read it, but Don Watson grew up in Gippsland and has written an account of Highlanders and the alienation of Aboriginal people's lands in Gippsland. Each Australian state had a slightly different version of the triple helix in its history. The state of Victoria's path was influenced by Major Thomas Mitchell's description of Western Victoria after his 1836 expedition as Australia Felix, a lush and fertile place for pastoralists and for sheep. A squatting rush resulted in the Western districts in the late 1830s and 40s. Warwick Station, outside present-day Casterton, was run by several generations of the Robertson family who came to Australia from Scotland came to Victoria from Scotland via Tasmania. And what you see here represents a few of perhaps 30 historic buildings still in existence here. It's utterly beautiful and it has an Edna Walling garden, but that is a rabbit hole. There was fierce resistance to the pastoral invasion by Aboriginal people in various parts of Victoria, with the Gunditjmara from around Budgebim and Lake Conda especially fierce. The Umarella Wars from the mid-1830s to the mid-1840s resulted, with sheep as well as shepherds under attack from one side and many Aboriginal people massacred on the other. As so often in Australian history, the richest and most densely populated land with the most striking and beautiful landscape was the hardest fought over. By the late 1860s, however, Geelong was the Australian centre for wool manufacturing, and it was Melbourne that drew my great-grandfather to move from Yorkshire in the mid-1860s to get involved in some of the earliest wool auctions. Here in Ballarat, of course, I think it's 1872 that your woolen mill is set up, and a very substantial one it was too, with making uniforms for the militia was part of its early functioning. Wikipedia told me over coffee, so don't look for too much detail on that point. As the wool industry developed at scale across much of Australia, various kinds of sailing ships, including the clipper Cutty Sark, competed to get to London in time for the November wool sales. Two different designs of clipper race in this painting, which I found discarded on the streets of East Brisbane about 5 years back, which was remarkable. The invention of steamships and the opening of the Suez Canal briefly consolidated London's hold on the world's wool auctions, but telegraphy becoming truly intercontinental, coming down from Darwin to Adelaide and connecting up with the other cities in the early 1870s, began the decisive shift to Australian auctions. By the early 20th century, Sydney was on track to becoming the world's biggest wool auction centre. Wool buyers from around the world spent several months each year here buying wool before spending summers in the Northern Hemisphere consulting with their wool manufacturing clients. This included buyers from Germany, who by 1914 had a wool manufacturing sector almost as big as Britain's, almost all of that wool imported. Germany stockpiled Australian wool from 1912, but it wouldn't save them come World War I, as Madelyn will fill you in.
Okay, here we are, wrong page. Along the way of researching wool and war, we realized that wool shortages led to desperate nations searching for alternatives. First of these alternatives was shoddy, which the original was from, originally started to be produced in about 1810 in Batley and Dewsbury in Yorkshire. The textile industry technical term for recycled wool is shoddy. It is not until the shoddy scandals of the American Civil War when all of a sudden the US Army, the Union Army, went from 18,000 in December of 1860 to about 500,000 in June of 1861. And the contracts went out and all the uniform manufacturers said, oh, of course we can get the cloth, and the textile manufacturers said, of course we can get the cloth. Oops, we don't have any wool. So they started incorporating a little more shoddy than they should have. And the uniforms didn't hold up very well. So it was big scandals, and that is when the word shoddy became synonymous with inferior quality. It was a relatively benign term before that. So even though they used shoddy, and there were legitimate uses for shoddy, the canteen cover had a cotton warp and a shoddy weft, and all it had to do was provide insulation for the canteen. They used it in blankets because they threw their blankets away on the march. The quartermasters were always hysterical. They never keep anything. So it wasn't good enough, though, because you still had to get the rags, and that still had to be imported, and so you were still worrying about your supply chain. Chapter 4 focuses on the story of wool in the First World War. So this is a pivotal event in wool's history. From early on, Britain treated wool as a strategic commodity, declaring wool and woolen goods to be contraband and imposing a blockade on German ports to try and stop them from getting any of the textile fibers that they needed to wage war effectively. It worked. Wool was a major target of the war at sea, both surface and submarine. There's a very famous Australian example of this when the SS Troilus is laden with Australian wool, is sunk by the German ship Emden, which then shortly after succumbed to the HMAS Sydney. Overall, however, Britain really had a huge commercial shipping advantage. And as Britain's blockade of German ports bit hard, the German military looted the regions that it had occupied. This included rendering textile factories unusable, first by sending equipment and any textile fiber supplies, even including mattresses that they collected from civilians for the contents that they could turn into yarn, back to Germany for factories. Then they would smash whatever equipment couldn't be used or moved. From late 1916, all UK and Empire wool auctions were shut down, and Britain compulsorily acquired both the domestic wool clip of the UK and the wool of Australia and New Zealand at a fixed average price that made Australasian farmers none too happy, especially in relation to wartime inflation. This leads to the discussion, I'm going to move on here a little bit early. This leads to the discussion in Chapter 5 of how Germany was forced to investigate many substitutes during that war: paper, seaweed, nettles, and the waste fibers from manufacturing the very recently introduced semi-synthetic fiber that we now call rayon. Textiles made of spun paper yarns were, I guess we can say they were the least worst. They called on supplies of cellulose from Germany's plentiful forests, as well as the equally plentiful forests of Sweden, neutral to the north, which they were able to import. None of these experiments challenged the supremacy of wool for soldiers trying to survive the cold, wet, muddy trenches, let alone enemy action. And interwar, many other wool have-not nations would join the search for better alternatives. And I just want to point out that this suit and this, I think this is an ammunition pouch, they are literally spun paper yarns, and the suit feels like cloth. It's amazing. All right, am I still talking? Yes. Yep. Chapter 6 and 7 look, oh, I'm sorry, I moved that too fast. Chapter 6 and 7 look at how many nations who learned from World War I and were preparing, of course, for the next war, which would involve even bigger armies with even greater needs for wool, led to investment in developing semi-synthetic rayon and then fully synthetic alternatives. And these would eventually diminish wool's position. Immediately after the war, rayon, which had been known until 1924 as artificial silk, became the focus of many experiments to make it more like cotton or wool. These, invented in the mid-19th century, rayon became commercially viable in about 1910, but it was limited by its quite dazzling shine up at the top, which it was incredibly weak. It was even weaker when it was wet, and the fierce chemicals required to turn the cellulose into a solution that could be extruded and then to harden it up afterwards. Rayon really only truly began to challenge wool in the 1930s after the development of matte finished rayon staple right at the bottom, which was much more like cotton or wool, and it could be spun just like, or more importantly, with cotton and wool. From that point on, rayon production rose sharply and consistently throughout the 1930s. And this particularly happened in Germany, Japan, the US, Italy, all of them wool have-not nations in the First World War, but very surprisingly, the UK, which had suffered from its supply chain issues. In Germany, Italy, and Japan, autarky, which is economic self-sufficiency, took hold in the 1930s. So essentially for the textiles, it meant that the preferred textiles were those that could be made from the nation's own resources. And the Italian futurist poet Marinetti wrote poems extolling Italian rayon for the consumer, and also another semi-synthetic that was made of the casein protein from milk, which was called lannitol. These three governments put great energy into convincing their citizens of the superiority of rayon to natural fibers. And by the late 1930s, they were all three mandating the addition of rayon into all civilian fabrics made either of cotton or wool. And that was in order to conserve those fabrics for the military. As the US, France, and even Britain also invested in rayon production and research, astute observers, and I think after spending several days in the National Library reading the J.F. Guthrie papers, I would say almost especially J.F. Guthrie, Australian Senator Guthrie, began to see the threat of staple rayon to wool.
So meanwhile, Australia regained its position at the heart of the world's wool market after World War I, with wool buyers from around the world based in Australia. Telegraphic codes were essential for wool buyers to communicate with their clients half a world away, and these codes reflect some of the tensions of the 1920s and especially the 1930s. Germany's position as a huge market for Australian wool before World War I changed and was challenged between the wars. The Versailles Treaty required Germany to use as little foreign currency as possible to secure wool so they could pay what were truly punishing reparations. Letters between German wool buyer Eberhard Noltenius and Australian pastoralist and Major General's daughter Agnes Mackay give us an insider's view of how these tensions played out in a personal relationship. That's one of my favourite bits of the book. And yeah, to see these kind of personal family stories against the backdrop of this big history. Japan by the early 30s had risen to being Australia's second biggest market for wool. This supported its territorial ambitions in Manchuria and elsewhere. But this market, like others, was compromised by Britain's determination to have Australia and its other dominions put the UK's economic interests first. As World War II approached, the wool market again boomed, but there were underlying weaknesses that war and its aftermath would expose. Chapter 8 starts with World War II, which in terms of wool was more or less a replay of 1914-18, but with even more millions of soldiers. Wool was once again a major strategic resource, and Britain similarly commandeered the wool of its dominions, including Australia, right from the beginning of the war at a price lower than they'd paid in World War I. Initially, it did come up by about 42. Nations, including the US and Australia, kept their soldiers fighting in cold climates in pure woolen uniforms. But nations such as Japan and Germany were using textile blends for their soldiers. According to one source, German soldiers started out the war in uniforms 85% wool, 15% rayon. By the end of the war, switcheroo, 15% wool, 85% rayon. Meanwhile, civilians in many nations got used to their wool being blended with other textiles, especially rayon, during World War II. Governments decreed this to save as much of the precious resource of wool for the military as possible. At the New York World's Fair in 1939, DuPont released nylon, the first fully synthetic textile. DuPont's key initial product had been producing gunpowder for both sides in World War I. They invested their huge profits from this trade into creating new chemical products, most especially textiles, after an early 1930s book called Merchants of Death and an associated US Senate inquiry labelled them war profiteers. Nylon resulted from many, many years of laboratory research and was not a huge element of fighting in World War II. But during the war, DuPont worked hard to prototype a different synthetic known as Fibre A, which would eventually become all-on acrylic. And meanwhile, a British company, ICI, built on DuPont research to create terylene, now known as polyester, and of course the most common contemporary textile. Neither all-on nor polyester were usable during World War II. It was the laboratory research. It would take the Korean War of 1950-53 for full synthetics to really start to strike a killer blow against wool. After Australia and the US had worked so closely in the Pacific War, the US expected the kind of privileged access to Australian and New Zealand wool that the UK had enjoyed in the First and Second War. It didn't happen. Australia and New Zealand were starting to get a sniff of how Russia and its satellite states would be a huge and ongoing market. With no time to resolve this conflict or to negotiate access, and fears of a war also and again breaking out in Eastern Europe, the US Congress passed a bill to buy wool at whatever price necessary, creating a boom in Australia and New Zealand that lingered long and fondly in many sheep pastoralist memories. I wonder whether there's anybody here that experienced it as kids. But wool was by now not the only way to keep a soldier or a civilian warm. And even before the war had ended, the US wool manufacturing sector began a long slide. In Australia, though the wool price bubble significantly deflated, Eastern Bloc countries provided substantial new markets for wool. There were so many uniformed personnel to be clothed. And so my grandfather's company that had just focused on supplying the American market pivoted to supply Egypt and Poland and East Germany, etc.
In the US, the story is quite different. From the mid-1950s, as the family automobile, central heating, and clothes dryers became increasingly ubiquitous, wool was losing its spot as the civilian fabric of choice to keep warm, at least pure wool. There were a lot of blends on the market. Despite the industry's awareness of the weaknesses of its early synthetics, massive marketing budgets, and the fact that the uniform nature of synthetic fibers makes them cheaper and easier to manufacture into textiles, encouraged their dominance in the market. Wool prices would be artificially held high throughout the 1980s, but the Australian Reserve Price Scheme collapsed at the beginning of 1990, around the same time as the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union and its satellite states. And the wool business never really recovered and is now less than 1% of global textiles. No. Did we?
Yeah.
Did we see that one?
Yep.
Okay. I hope you read it because this is the list of what they knew was wrong with Orlan. They were lying. Okay. As the wool market was collapsing, polyester microfleece, and its first trademark was Polar Tech, was invented at the Malden Mills in Massachusetts, which had spent its first 50 years as a woolen mill. It revolutionized the cold climate fabric market, while at the same time companies increasingly began to blend polyester with cotton or wool, and also tout stretch in clothing fabrics as an issue of comfort as opposed to the cost of production. Consumers grew used to having more and more clothes at cheaper and cheaper price points. According to a reputable 2024 report, Australia and the US topped the list for buying and then throwing away the most cheap synthetic textiles. I don't think either of us should be proud of that. Many people still don't recognize that the microplastic fibers from those textiles are invading our oceans, our air, our brains, our bodies. Recycling, remaking, rethinking our relationship to consuming textiles really has to be part of our future, or we won't have one. And it also has to be part of our continuing war on waste. It was really difficult, but we had to stop somewhere. We just kept finding things. Even just this past April, I was in the RAF Museum just on the outskirts of London, and I'm looking in this, and I was like, this is a German World War I sort of uniform for somebody who was doing chores. And I thought, that's paper, which I hadn't seen that before, so that was exciting. And then New Zealand has a whole raft, like 2 crates full of paper things that had been picked up, some of it in France and some of it in the Middle East, by New Zealand soldiers who were just taking home souvenirs. So there's a lot more out there, but we're done. So as you can see here in the decade plus that we've worked on this project, we have published some parts of our research and our argument. But Fleeced represents a really much more extended account and fuller argument of how it is that we live today surrounded by synthetics, with wool largely a commodity for the well-heeled and the aficionado of extreme sports. We do know, because we're not silly, that wool, like all fibers, natural and synthetic, has its own range of environmental and social impacts, and that the ever-increasing global population makes it impossible for us to survive on natural fibers alone. This makes, as I said before, the aesthetics and practices of fast fashion, the rejection of those practices and aesthetics, ever more imperative for all of us. Thank you.
Madelyn and Trish. Oh, gosh, that's loud. Now, we're going to have some questions, and I'd like to ask your assistance because we're going to film the question time. So if you could be patient, if you want to ask a question, just wait for me to get to you with the microphone, because that way we'll have your question as part of the film. So, do we have any questions? Down the back, just one moment, please.
Ladies, do you think that the impetus to develop synthetics and all the innovations to process wool could have happened independently of war?
That's a really interesting question. Thank you for that.
I think it would. I think some of it would have happened. I don't think. I mean, they were looking at artificial silk in the mid-19th century, mostly because there was a blight on the silkworms. And so they were trying to figure out a way to replace silk. And that's where rayon came from originally. And they worked on that, I don't know, for 60 years before they got it to be, viable commercially. But I think there's always been in the textile industry. When I worked at the American History Museum at the Smithsonian, we had a huge collection of patent models from the patent office. And I think the museum had 1,000 patent models given to them by the patent office. 400 of those were for textile products. I mean, textile patents of some kind or another. And I think that the industry itself was very, very inventive.
Can I come in and just add something there? I think, is it Trotsky that says that war is the locomotive of history? I think that, what we saw was absolutely a speeding up and an intensifying. There's no question that the strategic needs and uses of wool sped up this increasingly desperate search for alternatives. But, we quite like playing with a little bit of hypothetical history, saying that if there had never been, if wool had never been industrialised in the 19th century, would the kind of trench warfare of the 20th century been possible? You can't know what would have happened in the absence of wars, but
it was hard enough to outfit 4 million men over the course of 4 years during the U.S. Civil War. The World War I, 60 to 70 million soldiers fought in that war. And then how do you even get, there aren't enough sheep, 20 sheep per person. There aren't enough sheep in the world. There had to be, other kinds of inventiveness to do that. So I'm not sure that all of I think too many other things would have had to, population would have had to stay low, and people, wouldn't have had to do world wars.
We have some more questions just down the front.
Hi, thank you for your very interesting talk. I had a question about the Civil War, actually. It's probably a fairly simple one, but my image of the two sides is the Union soldiers in the blue and the Confederate soldiers sort of scrappy. If they're in a uniform at all, it's sort of a grey one. And I'm just wondering, is this whole idea that, my understanding of the war is that the Union kind of controlled the ports, so were able to prevent imports. And is that a very simple explanation for why the Confederates didn't have this army that seemed to be wearing the same uniform, or the...
They actually, both armies at the beginning of the war were for the first 6 months, were clothed by local militias.
Oh.
That didn't work so well because a lot of Union militias were wearing gray, and a lot of Southern militias were wearing blue. And so, who are we shooting at? This is one aspect of uniforms. You have to know who your enemy is. And so the federal government stepped in, and the Southern Confederate government tried very hard to step in, but the states were pretty adamant that they controlled their own militias, their own armies. It's really a fascinating time, because even the supply chains went so far. There's a thing that we talk about in the book, or I quote in the book, where one soldier who's in the Sherman's march from Atlanta to the sea, 1864-65, when they start at the railhead, when they get off the train and they get into their marching order, they're all in blue, right? They look fabulous. By the time they get to the sea, they're in whatever they could pick up. So, and that's the Union Army, because they had just outrun their supply chain, their trains.
Oh, because it was like horseback then still, wasn't it? So it's much slower than came later. Thank you so much.
Any more questions?
One here.
Okay, just one moment.
These new synthetics that have come through from the 30s, they're fossil fuel derivatives.
Yes.
So that's where the cellulose comes from.
Plastic.
No, cellulose is what what makes rayon. The fossil fuel derived are from polymer. It's a long chain polymer, and I'm not a scientist, and I find it hard to explain that. But they're plastic. It's a polyester and acrylic are different kinds of plastic.
Thank you, ladies.
I'm just wondering whether speculators and investors were cheering at the prospect of war.
Oh, yes.
I'm going to, the document that I read in New York in July 2014 that I thought, my grandfather has been buying wool for an American company as an employee from 1907 to 1915. Now he's been given the opportunity to ask for a percentage. And what he says, at a time such as this, after what I imagine were, profits very high, any percentage that I ask for will seem too much. So I wouldn't say that my grandfather was, saying war, bring it on, but he sure as hell is recognising a business opportunity. So at the heart of this, one has to recognise that there is an economics attached.
And companies like DuPont, which was supplying gunpowder to both sides, I think, at one point Trish interviewed Charlie Massey, and he said that the profits made in wartime for textile manufacturers was a ruthless rubbing together of hands.
Any more questions? I've got one here, and I'll be back.
People remember, I have a brother who had polio when the polio epidemics were on, and we lived in a farm high up in the mountains, and he was told when he came out of hospital that if he slept on a horsehair mattress, that would be the most comfortable sleep he would get. And as a younger child, I used to get that horsehair mattress to sleep on if we had visitors, because it was like sleeping on a bed of nails. But they also had a horsehair blanket that was used during the war, and that was probably about 1/2 an inch thick, but very, very uncomfortable.
Thank you for that comment.
Okay, I've got a question down the front.
And while you're getting to that, I think that the people in Belgium and northern France who had their mattresses confiscated by the Germans to have the stuffing torn out and sent back to make yarn would have even liked horsehair mattresses.
You mentioned about wool and rayon sort of being sort of swapping over. I was just wondering about Operation Barbarossa, through Siberia when the Germans invaded Russia, whether not having wool was a major contributing factor to their dying of exposure.
We wonder about, I can't comment on Operation Barbarossa, but we do wonder whether, Germany not having access to the wool that it would have wanted may be a factor. And certainly the fact that Germany stockpiles wool before World War I, again before World War II, even with the whole Versailles strictures, it would suggest that the powers that be regarded wool as critical. But beyond that, I can't say.
Okay, now there's a question out the back. Just one moment. And then I'll take one more after this, and then we'll wind up.
Have you looked at the role of Australian woolen manufacturers? I'm thinking here of, to give some local examples, Bruck Mills in Wangaratta, who manufactured a lot of fabrics for clothing, and also the blanket manufacturers, which were widespread throughout Australia.
I grew up under Dr. Blanket, sleeping on an open veranda. But yes, that's all very interesting. Early on, the Brits have a mercantilist philosophy. They're very concerned. There are early documents that we quote that Australia will be a source of supply to Britain, to the British manufacturing, but will not sort of compete with them with fine fabrics. World War II is very interesting in that regard. Ipswich, of course, is the Queensland equivalent of Geelong, Ballarat, other industrial towns and cities in Victoria. In World War II, suddenly the Ipswich mills are allowed to produce a lot of wool, including uniforms for US soldiers. So, and I think your mill comes here in 1872. It feels like there are lots of Australian mills from the early 1870s. So there is a kind of, the Australian colonies kind of stretching their muscles a bit against the mother country. But Britain does not want Australia to be a manufacturing powerhouse like those upstart Americans.
Which they did their darndest to level out after the War of 1812, where they immediately, when the war was over, they dumped cheap fabrics, cottons, and textiles on the American market to try and squelch those upstarts.
Hi, thank you for a great talk. I'm just wondering, so you talk about obviously World War One and World War Two, and so you talk about Germany stockpiling wool, and then when you started talking about Korea, obviously it was going into more synthetic fabrics. Have you looked any further, like past that at war's sense, if there's any kind of, I guess, like stockpiling of wool? I mean, I know recently Germany said they were going to build their army up again and become the greatest army in Europe. And I'm just wondering if, say, current or future wars, whether that would be more of a reliance on synthetics, or do you think you'd see a swing back to wool?
About 7 or 8 years ago, I forget now how exactly when, the U.S. Army began to rethink its relationship to wool, because in the 60s it had started to just cut wool out as much as possible. And the reason that they did that is that synthetics melt on you if you, on your skin, if you managed somehow to be in the way of an IED, and there's flame. And that has exacerbated hugely the burn injuries in Iraq and Afghanistan. And they are not the only military to have that epiphany. So for a while, a few years ago, and a lot of things that I could find sort of pre-COVID, I've not been able to find advancing on since then. But they were experimenting with a sort of fatigue or combat uniform that was 70% wool, 15% Nomex, and 15% Kevlar. So flame resistance and bullet, impact resistance. So, but I don't know what the outcome of that has been. And I know that Australia too was beginning to research getting back more to wool for field uniforms. It's why some of us always wear wool on airplanes.
All right, thank you. Wonderful questions. So great talk and a really interesting question time. Just got one last question. So Great Britain commandeered the wool from its empire, Australia, New Zealand, perhaps South Africa. How about South America? Uruguay, Argentina, where did their wool go during wartime?
Well, that's really interesting. They did not commandeer South Africa in the First World War, but they controlled most of the shipping. So because because the U.S. had a very strong divided woolen industry that was a very sort of Anglo industry in New England and Pennsylvania, and then in New Jersey was very German descended. The Brits didn't trust the Americans, wisely, before we got into the war. And so they didn't want them shipping wool through a back door. So I've lost my train of thought.
South America, what happens? Commandeer.
They can't get it because Britain controls the shipping. So Britain will say, well, yeah, you can have some of it in a few months when we have a ship.
And Britain overall, with its dominions, controls 30% of wool overall, but 50% of apparel wool. So there might be some bits coming around the side, but yes, Britain had this kind of stranglehold of the apparel wools that you wanted for soldiers.
Interesting, thank you. Now, I'd just like to remind everyone that we have copies of the book. They're at the front desk if you're interested, and Trish and Madelyn will be there to sign them if you'd like them signed. Now, I've got a small gesture of our thanks for both of you for being here, but especially for you, Madelyn, coming all this way. And if you could please join me in thanking our special guests.
You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you. That's been terrific. Thank you. Thank you. Fabulous. Thank you.
I find that the message of the Eureka Stockade resounds to me right now.
Thank you. You managed that beautifully.